Rubicon, The Triumph and Tragedy of the Roman Republic, by Tom Holland. Picture yourself standing on the edge of a small, unremarkable stream on a freezing winter night. The sun disappeared behind the mountains hours ago. Behind you, an army waits in silence. Battle-hardened soldiers who followed you through 8 years of bloodshed to the very edges of the world they know. Every one of them would die for you without question. Across that narrow ribbon of water lies everything you've ever wanted: home, Italy, the road to Rome itself. But here's the catch. An ancient law, rigid and unforgiving, says you cannot cross that stream with armed men at your back. Breaking that law isn't just illegal. It's treason. It's choosing civil war against your own people. Your enemies in Rome, terrified of what you've become and jealous of what you've achieved, have backed you into an impossible corner. You have two choices. Surrender your command, watch everything you've built crumble to dust, and face certain destruction at the hands of your political rivals. Or you cross the river. This was the impossible moment facing Julius Caesar on January 10, 49 BC, as he stared into the dark waters of a little river called the Rubicon. The Romans had a perfect word for this: discrimin. That knife-edge moment where an entire life, maybe an entire civilization, balances on a single decision. In his brilliant book Rubicon, historian Tom Holland doesn't just take us to that riverbank. He plunges us into the beating heart of the society that created this moment. He reveals the final 100 years of the Roman Republic, an era of breathtaking triumph and horrifying violence, populated by giants like Caesar, Pompey, Cicero, and Cleopatra. This isn't some dusty history lesson. This is the story of how a civilization that built its entire identity on freedom, on being a republic without kings, ended up tearing itself apart in the pursuit of power and glory. It's about how ambition, wealth, and empire can push a society past the point of no return. Here's what I promise you: by the time we're done, you'll understand the deep patterns that destroyed Rome. You'll see how a society built on competition can plant the seeds of its own destruction. You'll recognize how their struggles, the eternal tension between freedom and order, between personal ambition and the common good, echo through our world today, shaping our politics and maybe even our own choices. This isn't just about ancient men in togas. It's a mirror reflecting the timeless challenges of power itself. So how does a republic actually die? How does a nation that built itself on the idea of shared power, of absolute freedom from the tyranny of kings, end up with an emperor? To understand the collapse, we first need to understand what the Roman Republic really was. And what it was, more than anything else, was a walking contradiction. Forget the gleaming marble city from the movies. For most of its existence, Rome was chaotic, sprawling, and often filthy. Tom Holland shows us a city that was simultaneously a construction site and a junkyard. The Romans worshipped tradition and revered their ancestors with almost religious intensity, yet they were also ruthlessly practical. They kept what worked, adapted what failed, and built their future directly on top of the messy ruins of their past. This contradictory spirit was the Republic's soul. Roman citizens didn't see themselves as subjects of anyone. They were free men. Their entire identity was forged in competition. Life was an endless contest for honestas, a word capturing both moral excellence and public reputation. Your worth was exactly what your fellow citizens said it was. This created a burning, almost unbearable hunger for glory in every Roman heart. That hunger drove them to conquer their neighbors, then all of Italy, and then, with shocking speed, the entire Mediterranean world. The Romans believed their freedom was the engine driving these conquests. As Holland puts it, it is almost beyond belief how great the Republic's achievements were once the people had gained their liberty. Such was the longing for glory which it lit in every man's heart. But this system had a fatal crack running through its foundation. While citizens learned to temper their competitive instincts for the common good at home, absolutely no such rules applied to outsiders. Their approach to war was uniquely terrifying. When they stormed a city, their practice was to slaughter everything alive, every man, woman, child, and even animal, not in some savage frenzy, but as a calculated act of terror. This ruthlessness This bottomless hunger for glory won them an empire, and that empire, slowly but surely, began poisoning the republic that had conquered it. The first warning tremors came with two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They were aristocrats with flawless pedigrees, but they saw the rot spreading through Roman society. The enormous wealth flooding in from conquered territories was concentrating in fewer and fewer hands, while the small farmers who'd been the backbone of the legions were being driven from their land, ending up in Rome's festering slums. In 133 BC, and then again a decade later, the Gracchi brothers used their office as tribunes, the people's protectors, to push radical reforms. They wanted to redistribute public land to the poor and sell them grain at subsidized prices. To the wealthy aristocracy, this wasn't just an attack on their profits. It was treason against the natural order. They saw the Gracchi not as reformers but as demagogues scheming to become tyrants. And so, for the first time in 4 centuries since the last king was expelled, political blood stained the streets of Rome. Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death with a wooden stool leg. 12 years later, his brother Gaius was hunted down and killed by the aristocracy's agents. They cut off his head, stuffed it with molten lead, and claimed their bounty. The murders of the Gracchi brothers marked a terrible turning point. They proved that any attempt at fundamental reform would be seen as a grab for absolute power, and that violence was now an acceptable political tool. The old rules were crumbling. A dangerous new precedent had been set. If the Gracchi cracked open the door to political violence, the two men who kicked it off its hinges were Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius was what Romans called a new man. He wasn't from any old noble family. He was a tough, brilliant soldier from the countryside who clawed his way to the top on pure ability. He reformed the army, opening its ranks to landless poor men for the first time. This change was necessary, but it had a profound and dangerous consequence. From that moment on, soldiers' loyalty belonged not to the Roman state, but to whichever general paid them, led them to victory, and promised them land when they retired. The legions were slowly transforming into private armies. Sulla was Marius's opposite in every way. He was a patrician from an ancient but broke family, a man of decadent tastes and ice-cold cruelty. He first served under Marius, and the two men developed a bitter, festering rivalry that would eventually consume the Republic. Their feud represented a clash between two kinds of ambition: Marius, the outsider fighting his way up, and Sulla, the aristocrat, determined to restore the old order by any means necessary. The breaking point came over who would command a lucrative war against a dangerous eastern king named Mithridates. The command promised enormous glory and wealth. When Marius used political manipulation to steal the command from Sulla, who was consul at the time, Sulla did something unthinkable. He turned his army around and marched on Rome itself. It was a moment of shocking sacrilege. No Roman general had ever led legions against their own city. The act was a declaration that his personal honor mattered more than the Republic's most ancient laws. He took the city, declared his enemies outlaws, and then, after settling his affairs, went off to fight Mithridates. But the cycle of violence had barely started. While Sulla was away, Marius returned with his own faction and launched a brutal purge of Sulla's supporters. Senators' heads ended up on pikes in the Forum. Marius finally achieved his long-prophesied 7th consulship, but he died just days into it, a man eaten alive by bitterness and rage. When Sulla returned from the east in 83 BC, victorious and battle-hardened, he was determined to have his revenge. The civil war that followed was horrific. For the first time, Romans systematically hunted and killed other Romans on a massive scale. Sulla emerged as absolute master of Rome. He declared himself dictator, an ancient emergency office, but instead of holding it for a few months as tradition demanded, he held it indefinitely. Then he unleashed the prescriptions. Lists of his enemies were posted in the forum, and anyone on those lists could be killed on sight for a reward. It was a reign of terror that saw thousands murdered and their property seized. Sulla used this bloodbath to reshape the state, strengthening the Senate and crippling the office of tribune, the very position the Gracchi had used to challenge the elite. He was trying to turn back time, to restore the Republic to what he believed it should be. And then, having remade the state in his own image, he did something even more shocking than marching on Rome. He voluntarily gave up his power. He retired to his villa to live out his days in decadent pleasure. Sulla believed he'd saved the Republic from itself. But what he'd really done was provide a terrifying blueprint for its destruction. He'd shown that a man with a loyal army could impose his will on the state. He demonstrated that political rivalry could escalate to mass murder. The question haunting the next generation was simple and terrifying. Sulla could do it. Why can't I? Into this broken world, a new generation of ambitious men emerged, shaped by the violence and cynicism of the civil wars. 3 of them towered above all others: Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. Gnaeus Pompeius, known as Pompey the Great, was a military prodigy. He'd raised a private army for Sulla while still a teenager, earning the nickname the Teenage Butcher. He had genius for war and even greater genius for self-promotion. He styled himself as a new Alexander the Great, and the Roman people worshipped him. He was their hero, a man who seemed to win victories effortlessly. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in Rome. He'd built his fortune through shrewd, often ruthless business dealings during Sulla's proscriptions. He understood better than anyone that in this new Rome, money was power. He operated in the shadows, a master manipulator, extending his influence through a vast web of debt and obligation. And then there was Gaius Julius Caesar, a patrician from one of Rome's most ancient families. They claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself. Caesar possessed a lethal combination of charm, brilliance, and limitless ambition. As a young man, his family connections to Marius had made him a target of Sulla, forcing him into hiding. The experience taught him ruthlessness and self-reliance. These 3 men were fierce rivals. Yet in 60 BC they did something unprecedented. They decided the political system, with all its checks and balances, was an obstacle to their ambitions. So they formed a secret pact to pool their resources and carve up the state between them. This alliance, known as the First Triumvirate, wasn't a formal office. It was a private gentleman's agreement to subvert the Republic. As Holland puts it, it was effectively a 3-headed monster. Pompey wanted his military settlements in the east ratified and land for his veterans. Crassus wanted a lucrative military command to match Pompey's glory. Caesar, the junior partner, wanted the consulship followed by a long-term command in Gaul. They got everything they wanted. Caesar became consul in 59 BC, and using a mixture of bribery, intimidation, and Pompey's veterans, he rammed through the triumvirate's agenda, completely ignoring the Senate's opposition. His co-consul, a man named Bibulus, was so intimidated he locked himself in his house for the rest of the year, effectively leaving Caesar as Rome's sole ruler. Having secured his goals, Caesar departed for his command in Gaul. For the next 9 years, while Pompey and Crassus bickered in Rome, Caesar was engaged in one of history's most remarkable military campaigns. He conquered all of Gaul, modern France, a land of fierce warrior tribes. He crossed the Rhine into Germany, and even launched 2 expeditions to the mysterious island of Britain. But this was more than conquest. In Gaul, Caesar was forging something far more valuable than territory: a massive, battle-hardened army whose soldiers were fanatically loyal to him personally. He also amassed a staggering fortune from plunder, which he used to buy political support back in Rome. He was building his power base, preparing for the day he would return. Back in Rome, the triumvirate was falling apart. Crassus, finally getting his wish for military glory, launched an ill-advised invasion of Parthia, a powerful eastern kingdom. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, his army was annihilated, and Crassus himself was killed. Legend says the Parthians, knowing his reputation for greed, poured molten gold down his throat. With Crassus dead, only two giants remained, Pompey and Caesar. And the Republic wasn't big enough for both of them. Pompey, who'd remained in Rome, watched Caesar's spectacular success in Gaul with growing alarm. The man he'd once considered his junior partner was becoming his equal, perhaps even his superior. The traditionalist faction in the Senate, led by the stoic and unbending Cato the Younger, saw their opportunity. They courted Pompey, seeing him as the only man who could stand against Caesar's ambition. They painted Caesar as a dangerous radical, a would-be tyrant who would destroy the Republic. The Senate demanded Caesar give up his command and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand for the consulship. But Caesar knew what that meant. Without the legal immunity of his command, his enemies would immediately prosecute him for his illegal acts during his first consulship. Conviction would mean the end of everything. He offered a compromise. Let both he and Pompey lay down their commands simultaneously. Pompey, now allied with the Senate, refused. The deadlock was complete. And so we return to that riverbank in the winter of 49 BC. Caesar had been backed into a corner. Before him lay the Rubicon. Crossing it meant civil war. Turning back meant ruin. He hesitated, tormented by the sheer weight of the decision. A lifetime's achievements hung in the balance. But then, as Holland vividly describes, he made up his mind, as if seized by a gambler's reckless passion. The die is cast, he said, and gave the order to advance. The civil war that followed tore the Roman world apart. This wasn't a war of ideologies, but a clash of two colossal ambitions. Pompey had the Senate's backing and the resources of the East. Caesar had his veteran legions from Gaul and a reputation for lightning speed. Instead of waiting for Pompey to assemble his full strength, Caesar launched a blitzkrieg through Italy. Town after town opened its gates to him. Pompey and the Senate, caught completely off guard, were forced to abandon Rome and flee across the sea to Greece. Caesar had won Italy without a major battle, but the war was far from over. He first secured his position by defeating Pompey's armies in Spain. Then, in 48 BC, he followed Pompey to Greece. At the Battle of Pharsalus, despite being heavily outnumbered, Caesar won a decisive victory. His tactical genius was on full display. He famously ordered his men not to throw their javelins, but to use them as spears aimed at the faces of Pompey's cavalry, knowing the young noblemen would rather flee than risk scarring their handsome faces. Pompey fled the battlefield, utterly broken. He sought refuge in Egypt, but the advisors to young Pharaoh Ptolemy XIII decided it was safer to curry favor with the winner. As Pompey stepped ashore, he was stabbed to death. His severed head was presented to Caesar when he arrived days later. Caesar, far from being pleased, wept. He'd wanted to defeat his rival, not see him murdered so ignominiously. But now, with Pompey dead, Caesar was the undisputed master of the Roman world. What followed was a whirlwind. Caesar was trapped in Alexandria for months, caught up in a local power struggle. It was here he met the young queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. She was intelligent, ambitious, and utterly captivating. They became lovers, and she bore him a son, Caesar Warion. After finally leaving Egypt, Caesar mopped up the remaining pockets of Pompeian resistance. In Asia Minor, where he won a battle so quickly, he summarized it in the famous phrase, "I came, I saw, I conquered." In Africa, where Cato and the other die-hard republicans had regrouped. And finally, in Spain, where Pompey's sons made their final stand. By 45 BC, the civil war was finally over. Caesar returned to Rome not just as a victorious general, but as something new and unsettling. The Senate, desperate to appease him, showered him with unprecedented honors. He was made consul for 10 years, then dictator for life. His statue was placed in temples among the gods. Caesar was a whirlwind of reform. He revised the calendar, creating the Julian calendar we still use, with minor modifications, today. He planned vast building projects to transform Rome. He extended citizenship to people in the provinces. He was trying to heal a broken world. But for all his genius, he failed to solve the fundamental problem: what was his own position in the state? He was a king in all but name, and king was a title Romans despised with almost pathological hatred. Caesar seemed to scorn the Republic's traditions. He treated the Senate with visible contempt. He seemed to believe he was above the law. A conspiracy began forming against him, a group of senators who believed he was a tyrant, who had to be removed to restore liberty. The tragedy was that many conspirators weren't his old enemies, but men he considered friends, men he'd pardoned and promoted. The leaders were Cassius, a former Pompeian, and Marcus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar loved like a son. On the Ides of March to March 15, 44 BC, Caesar entered the Senate house. The conspirators crowded around him, pretending to present a petition. Then they drew daggers hidden beneath their togas and stabbed him to death. He fell at the foot of a statue of his great rival, Pompey. The assassins declared that liberty had been restored, but they'd made a fatal miscalculation. They'd killed the tyrant, but not his legacy, and they had absolutely no plan for what came next. Caesar's murder didn't restore the Republic. It plunged the Roman world into another, even more terrible round of civil war. 3 men emerged to fill the power vacuum. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal and hard-living deputy; Lepidus, another of Caesar's generals; and a surprising new player, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, a sickly but ruthlessly intelligent teenager named Gaius Octavius, whom we know as Octavian. These 3 formed a second triumvirate. Unlike the first, this was a formal, legal dictatorship. Their first act was to launch new proscriptions, even more brutal than Sulla's. They needed money for their armies, and they had scores to settle. Their most famous victim was Cicero, the great orator and defender of the Republic. Antony had long despised him. Cicero's head and hands were cut off and nailed to the speaker's platform in the Forum, a gruesome symbol that the age of free speech was over. The triumvirs then hunted down Caesar's assassins. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, the armies of Brutus and Cassius were defeated. Both men committed suicide. With them died the last real hope of the old Republic. But the world still wasn't at peace. The second triumvirate, like the first, soon collapsed. Lepidus was sidelined. The Roman world divided between 2 masters, Antony in the east and Octavian in the west. Antony went native. He set up court in Alexandria and resumed Caesar's affair with Cleopatra. Together they ruled the east like Hellenistic monarchs, dreaming of a new kind of empire, a fusion of Roman and Greek, with Alexandria as its capital. They had children and declared them rulers of vast territories. Back in Rome, Octavian skillfully weaponized this as propaganda. He portrayed Antony as a decadent traitor, a slave to a foreign queen who planned to move the empire's capital away from Rome. He cast himself as the champion of Roman tradition, of Italy, of the old ways. The final showdown came in 31 BC at the naval battle of Actium. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet was defeated. They fled back to Egypt. A year later, as Octavian's legions closed in on Alexandria, both Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. At 32 years old, Octavian, the boy who'd inherited nothing but a name, was the sole undisputed master of the entire Roman world. The civil wars were over. After a century of chaos and bloodshed, peace had finally arrived. But the Republic was dead. Octavian was too clever to call himself king or dictator. He knew the Romans would never accept that. So he performed a masterpiece of political theater. In 27 BC, he went before the Senate and announced he was restoring the Republic. He was handing all his powers back to the Senate and the people of Rome. The grateful senators, terrified of a return to anarchy, begged him to stay. They persuaded him to accept control of the most important provinces and armies. They gave him a new name, one that was sacred and venerable: Augustus. It was a brilliant fiction. Augustus claimed to be merely the first citizen, the princeps, ruling in partnership with the Senate. In reality, all power rested in his hands. He controlled the army, the treasury, and every lever of government. The old republican institutions, the assemblies, the consulships, continued to exist, but they were hollow shells. The Romans, exhausted by war and grateful for peace and stability, accepted this new order. They'd traded their liberty for security. The Republic, with its fierce competition, its glorious triumphs, and its catastrophic tragedies, was finished. The Roman Empire had begun. So what do we take from this incredible, sprawling, often brutal story? Why does the fall of the Roman Republic, an event from over 2,000 years ago, still grab us so powerfully? I think it's because, at its core, Rubicon isn't just about Rome. It's about the inherent tensions in any society that values both individual greatness and collective stability. It's a warning about what happens when ambition breaks free from responsibility. The Romans, as Tom Holland so brilliantly shows us, believed competition was the essence of life. The drive to be the best, to win glory, to have your name remembered forever. This was what made you Roman. For centuries, this drive fueled their astonishing success. It created a society of tremendous energy and resilience. But the Republic's fall is the story of that strength becoming a fatal weakness. As Rome's empire expanded, the prizes for success became astronomically huge. A command in the East wasn't just about glory anymore. It was about acquiring wealth that could buy elections, fund private armies, and make a man more powerful than the state itself. The system designed to channel ambition for the public good became a system rewarding those willing to destroy the public good for personal ambition. Men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar weren't necessarily evil. In many ways, they were the ultimate products of the Roman system. They were just playing the game with higher stakes and fewer rules than ever before. They possessed genius, courage, and incredible drive. But their greatness became so immense that the Republic itself couldn't contain it. They became like stars so massive they collapse into black holes, pulling the entire system in with them. And that, I believe, is the most profound lesson for us today. We live in a world that celebrates ambition. We're told to dream big, to disrupt, to change the world. That's powerful and wonderful. But Rubicon reminds us there's a dark side to that relentless drive. It asks us to consider the systems we operate in. Are they healthy? Do they reward cooperation as much as competition? Do they have checks and balances strong enough to contain the ambitions of the most powerful players? When a society's institutions weaken, when behavioral norms shatter, and when winning becomes the only thing that matters, it creates a dangerous vacuum. Rome's story shows us that in such a vacuum, the most ruthless, not necessarily the best, will rise. It shows us that people, when faced with chaos and instability, will often willingly trade their freedom for the promise of order. That's the tragic bargain that ended the Republic and birthed the Empire. So what can an ambitious person like you take from this? First, understand the game you're playing. Whether in school, your future career, or your community, pay attention to the unspoken rules and underlying systems. A system encouraging winner-take-all mentality can be dangerous. Second, think about the nature of your own ambition. Striving for greatness is noble. But greatness at what cost? Caesar conquered Gaul and became one of history's most famous men, but his ambition led to 1,000,000 deaths and the end of his country's freedom. Real leadership, the kind that endures, isn't just about personal glory. It's about building something that lasts. Something serving a purpose larger than yourself. Finally, don't underestimate the power of character and tradition. The men who tried to save the Republic, like Cato and Cicero, ultimately failed. But they failed while holding on to their principles. They understood that some things matter more than winning. In a world that often seems cynical and chaotic, holding on to a moral compass, understanding the value of institutions, and acting with integrity, these aren't signs of weakness. They're the foundations of true and lasting strength. That was a summary of Rubicon, The Triumph and Tragedy of the Roman Republic, by Tom Holland. We've journeyed through the highlights today, but I'll be honest. A summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you explore the territory yourself. The true magic of this book is in Holland's masterful storytelling, the way he brings these ancient figures to life, until you feel their ambition, their fear, and their humanity. This summary is designed to help you decide if this story is one you want to experience firsthand. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you think about power, ambition, and the world we live in. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this journey into the past valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It lets me know these stories matter, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration of another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.